like to focus now into the next section and go a little bit deeper in terms of the application of the TCFD to the real assets industry. We've really gone around the grounds and spoken about how net zero is so important in the TCFD application economy-wide. So I'd be interested to get your thoughts and hear why it should be a significant focus specifically for the real assets industry, and how you see that this industry fits in with the broader global emissions landscape.
Yeah, and that's an important question. Why we're here today, right? But real estate account for 1/3 of the total energy relative to CO2 emissions. And then what I like to think as well is that there's real uniqueness attached to private assets, but real assets in particular, right? So if you think about this, they are relatively liquid. If I compare to equity, right, I can sell my shares tomorrow. While if you invest into real assets, by nature, it's a lot more long-term, right?
Yeah.
The second thing is that, well, they are fixed in nature. You can hardly move a building the next day, right? So you there also for the long-term, geographically speaking. And then likewise, the energy consumption are quite fixed. So that means that these types of assets are typically greatly vulnerable to climate risks. So if I think of floods, for instance, right? Now, I think also one of the myths around this is that, it's all about physical risks. But actually, there are also some transition risks. So if you think of, for instance, transition costs, right? So there may be tax that would be implemented by regulators in that changing landscape. The other thing is cost via CapEx, right? So if you think of the cost of retrofitting, saving energy windows, or some kind of system of allowing for low carbon fuel switch, right? So obviously, right, so these can be seen as costs, but they can be turned into opportunities because they allow for reducing energy costs and also the carbon emissions, right?
Because we're seeing the management of climate risk in the last few years specifically becoming very high on the agenda. And so I'd be interested to hear, obviously we know that it's really important, but what are the key drivers that are actually instigating this increased demand, would you say, across the real estate sector?
So well, there's three main drivers, and I talked a lot about the regulation. You mentioned it as well, and so there's definitely more scrutiny and reporting required, right? Investors are probably the second driver. They have access to a lot more tools and mechanisms to assess and monitor these types of risks. They can understand really the types of risks they are exposed to in terms of transition and physical risks, and they can also attach a specific financial value that is at risk, right?
Yes.
And then what I find interesting is that it's not just the day-to-day management, but it's also around the full life cycle of the asset, right? So it's from the appraisal via the due diligence, but during the constructions or development of the asset and the sale, right? So that's the second driver. The third one is, again, I mentioned it before, but the fact that there's so much more investors, issuers setting net zero targets. A lot of them are part of net zero alliances. I think one example is the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance. It has now 74 members and it's growing. It has some of the largest global asset owners, so the likes of AXA, CalPERS, or Prudential here in Asia. And so these guys, again, right, they're coming together, they're setting standards, they're sharing ideas, and obviously, when they are setting mandates, then they're expecting their managers to look at climate risk and to integrate that into their investment process.
That makes sense. And I completely agree with those three drivers that you mentioned. Beyond understanding the potential risks of inaction which stem from the three drivers that you just mentioned, Cedric, as well as the concept of value at risk, how are you seeing leaders in the sector managing and mitigating these risks? We've already spoken about the value and the opportunity to be seen as a leader and a first mover advantage, but how are you seeing the leaders start to manage and move more quickly?
Yeah. So there's nuances, right? But I would say that amongst leaders, the main point is action, right? And this seems like a big word, but actually it's a few simple things. It starts with some kind of commitment at the board level or senior management level. Then it moves into investment into resources. The reality is that it's good to have the right people and experts. Climate is something that is quite technical, right? But also in terms of the right modeling tools, right? It's a bit like traditional financial risk, right? Climate risk, you need to have the right climate modelization solutions. Then it's about drawing clear responsibilities. Often integrating climate risks, it's at the junction of different teams. So often what we see is that it's the sustainability team working together with the risk team. And then once all of this has been done, it's a case of starting to look at the data, creating a baseline. And from there, then you can move into setting a strategy and then how to get there, right? So looking at how is my portfolio exposed, what are the lowest hanging fruit, so to speak, right? Do I need to engage with any of my holdings, etc., right? But really, the idea is that it's something that impacts portfolio constructions, it impacts asset allocations, and something that we see amongst the best practice, let's say, right? And in fact, I realized I think I just listed the kind of like the steps that are recommended by TCFD there, but again, it's quite simple, right?
I
when you
appreciate
think
the
about
summary.
it. Yeah. Thanks.
Definitely. It's quite simple, as you say, and having all those steps in place can put you in a position to set yourself up for success, to be in that leadership position within the sector and within the region. Maybe more specifically on some of the TCFD recommendations, and then more about their application within the real estate industry. The TCFD recommends disclosure for Scope 3 emission data, which is a key issue that the industry is tackling. So what would you be saying about what are you seeing on the ground in terms of best practice measurement and reporting on Scope 3 data, because it can be quite challenging?
Correct, yeah. So, and I mentioned it before, right? So Scope 3 is really now being included when measuring carbon emissions in terms of standard practice. And the idea is, again, right, you want to look at the full life cycle of an investment, of a product. So I always kind of dumb down the conversation. If I'm looking at an automobile manufacturer, looking at how the car is being used and the emissions being emitted, right? If you look at financial institutions, Scope 3 would be linked to financial emissions. So the investment I make into the companies or the loans that I'm making, right? So to give you, again, some perspective for the financial sector, Scope 3 is basically 80% of the total carbon emissions of that sector of financial institutions. Now, to your point, right? The challenge is that in terms of Scope 3 availability, the disclosure is very low. So we again looked at our 10,000 issuer as a reference universe, and only 25% of issuers are actually disclosing Scope 3 emissions. And when this is being disclosed, there's a real lack of uniformity, which makes it even more difficult to then compare one against the other. So what we're seeing happening is that the main practice currently in the market is to use some advanced estimation model for Scope 3 in order to measure those, right? One thing that I found quite interesting, and then if I could focus on real assets here, right, is again there's some debate and somehow a lack of consensus, right, in terms of how to consider, for instance, emissions from tenants and landlords. There's debate around whether it's Scope 2, is it Scope 3? It seems like in the region, increasingly investors are looking at Scope 3, right? But then goes back into, again, lack of availability and the challenge in terms of disclosure. Sometimes it's linked to the regulatory requirements, like in Australia, for instance, where there's no obligation for tenants to disclose energy usage or emissions, right? So I don't know if you have actually a view on this, Parrys.
I would completely agree with everything that you said. It's a complex equation, and particularly working across different jurisdictions across Asia, what data is actually available and who has a responsibility to provide you that data. We're looking at opportunities for green leases and smart meterings as a way to start to tap into that data, and thinking about how you can reduce the amount of assumptions you make versus the actual data that you can work with. So it's definitely a complex equation, and I see a lot of real estate companies and ESG people within real estate trying to crack that code.
Definitely.
Another recommendation from the TCFD that I wanted to touch on and get your thoughts on, Cedric, relates to scenario analysis. So what would you say is really important for companies when they're conducting this analysis, and how many scenarios do you think is enough? Because the scenario analysis is one small component in the TCFD. However, doing that is actually quite a big activity, and can provide a lot of great insights as well.
And taking a step back as well, right? I think there's a misconception. I mentioned it a bit before, right? Or on climate risk and the fact that these are like long term. That if I'm an investor, that I'm only investing for a few months or even like a 2, 3, 4 years, it doesn't really matter. Yep. But again, right, these are happening right now. I can mention like forest fires in the southwest of France, where I'm from, but closer to where we are, you see the increasing floods in Malaysia and Indonesia, right? And then the reality is that investors are now pricing these risks, right? So for instance, if I'm a real asset investor, I'm investing into an asset without taking into account these types of risks. At the time of the exit, well, the other investors, because they are integrating climate risks, may have a very different valuation than what I have, right? So that's why it's quite important to take these into account.
And there are a range of different climate scenarios and models that are available globally. So what would you say to anyone who's starting out on the journey about what scenarios to consider and use in their analysis?
Yes, and it can be quite confusing and daunting, right? But here again, right, if you pause and look at the landscape, the main scenarios currently being used are the NGFS scenarios. So NGFS and other acronyms is the Network for Greening the Financial System, and is basically central banks that came together and designed these scenarios, right? So these are the standards. Some investors look at having additional options. So in our tool, the MSCI Climate Value at Risk, we have more than 15 different scenarios, including NGFS. But the idea is basically investors want to stress test their portfolio under a certain number of conditions that are more or less aligned with their views, right? But again, if you take a step back, really at the beginning, what we recommend and what we see as best practice is to start with what is called an orderly scenario, meaning that basically the world will reach a 2 degree with some hypotheses on carbon price and geopolitical elements, right? But basically there's early action and ambitious targets. And so you want to compare what you get under this orderly scenario versus a disorderly scenario. And so disorderly, as you can guess, right, basically nothing goes according to plan. We face the risk of roasting at 3 degrees with some major physical risks, right? So there's no real set of scenarios. It's more about starting to play with the data, so to speak, right? But to get a sense of where the exposure is, get an understanding of how different scenarios are impacting my portfolio, and understanding what these different scenarios entail, right? But really, right, once you start on that, these steps, you get better clarity. And so therefore, you can then start to plan ahead and start to understand how you can mitigate and leverage these types of risk.
Yeah, it's providing you with decision useful information that you can
Exactly.
use more broadly across the business.
Exactly.
I can't believe I'm up to my last question of the day. I feel like our discussion has flown by and we've covered so much ground, which is really great. And I hope the audience has been enjoying as well. The last question that I wanted to ask you, Cedric, was what advice would you give to any real asset company who is just at the beginning of their TCFD journey, including what would you recommend as the priority actions that they focus on immediately?
Well, I think we kind of talked about it, but it's action, get in there, right? I think it's start calculating your baseline, start play with the data, with the number of scenarios. Think about personnel too, right? So do I need to hire sustainability experts, the training and certification for my employees? But I think it's equally important to also to discuss with your clients, because these clients are eager to learn more about this topic, and they are eager to learn how investors and managers are taking care of it, right? So that would be kind of my three suggestions.
I completely agree. And thank you again, Cedric, for sharing your insights in the session today. As I mentioned, we've really covered a lot of ground from the TCFD, setting net zero targets, and then diving into the opportunity for the real assets industry. So I hope everybody listening in has enjoyed the discussion and has found it insightful. Please tune in to the next episode, and thank you again for your time.
Thanks a lot, Parrys. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.